But when you get people and leaders in your church community putting their feet into the 1040 window, now they come back with passion, names, faces, places, personal responsibility, and then it fuses and clarifies, I think, for that spiritual family what focus, what lane they're going to have.
Thank you for watching the MAPS Global Podcast, where we discuss leadership and culture within the convergence of worship, prayer, and missions in your neighborhood and in the nations. Hey guys, welcome to the next episode on the MAPS Global Podcast. Yay! Today, today I'm here with everyone's favorite R.A. Martinez.
But who are you?
I'm Joel's. I'm Joel's, and I am hosting
from the
today.
great state of
Texas.
Texas.
Our Texas.
All my exes.
All
live in
hail the
Texas.
mighty state.
Wow.
Texas.
Sounds a little bit like a worship song.
It's not. It
Okay.
sounds a little bit like, yeah.
It's a big state. I was just there. We're not in January, but this is coming out in January. But in January, I was just there a couple months ago.
Oh, but you were also just there.
Like
that's
a
what
week
you
and a half ago. That's what I was.
Oh, okay.
When
I'm
this
going
comes
there
out-
in a week for Thanksgiving.
Let's go.
But this is January. It's January 2025. It's a new year. Okay. Congratulations. We've made it this far. And
Halfway through the 2020s.
that's right.
Mm.
Yeah.
Selah.
I know that phrase means a lot to you.
Halfway through the 2020s. It does
Uh-huh.
actually. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very cool to hear you talk about it.
Yeah.
Well, we're not going to talk about that right now.
Okay.
We're going to talk about short-term missions.
That's cool. This is cool. I'm
Yep.
looking forward to this.
Super excited. Personally, I just got back from a short-term trip. I was in North Africa.
That's right.
So I got back about a week ago.
You led a short-term trip for what, 10 days?
10 days.
10 days.
15 volunteers,
15.
which is actually a lot of people to move at one time.
That is.
Trains and planes and buses.
Yeah, planes, trains, and
Taxis.
automobiles. You led it with your wonderful husband and one of my favorite people to watch worship. And you took 15 people, multi-generational team. So the youngest
Yes.
on your team was...
Had turned 18 that week.
Turned 18 that week. And the senior side of your team was in the...
55 plus.
50s. Yeah, 50s, 60s. So amazing. So right there is something to talk about. But you led a multi-generational team, took them to where we already had a team on the ground that were already doing the house of prayer, the prayer room and outreach, serving the very, very small church in this nation, and working in coalition with other missions organizations. So you guys dropped in there and you guys did 35 hours of unbroken prayer and worship in one of the most unreached and one of the, not the most, but one of the most closed nations in terms of the gospel in the world. And got to pray, preach, and sing. And might be getting our head ourselves because I know you have a lot of stories, but I just want to encapsulate when we say, hey, you just got back from a short-term trip. That's what it looked like. And then you joined our team on the ground there in outreach, got to preach the gospel in a closed nation, which is amazing.
Adam and Eve to the resurrection. Multiple times.
Whoa, what is the
in
gospel?
Arabic.
Let's go. And then did 35 hours and then got to really encourage and strengthen some of the long-termers there, missionaries there. I've heard just from them, from the leaders there that we're in relationship with, just how encouraging and strengthening and life-giving, and gave them gas to keep going. Just you guys showing up and saying yes to them and working alongside them, both missions leaders, missionaries that are over there, long-termers, and then also, in this nation, it's difficult because you have to be very careful about how to work with local believers, national believers, but knowing from my relationships with those local leaders how honored, how much it's crazy how much they knew about what we were doing, what you guys are doing, and how honored they were that someone from around the world would love them enough to show up in their city and their nation and say, we're going to stand and pray with you. And so you guys did an amazing job. And so we want to do, I'm taking over. Sorry. I'll
Take it over.
to you. But we want to do this podcast. And I think this is a super interesting one because we're not necessarily going to do like a teaching thing, which is kind of par for the course with our podcast. But we're going to talk a little bit about the place and the role of short-term missions trips within the global missions enterprise, and especially frontier missions. That's where we work among the unreached. And then how, in the last 10 years, I've been running teams into Middle East, North Africa, Eurasia for over 10 years now. So, 12 years. And how we are doing short-term trips and how we are building on the ground in the 1040 window is actually re-envisioning the effectiveness and the place of short-term trips. And so I want to talk a little bit about, from our perspective, that I think there needs to be a re-envisioning of short-term trips, the place for them, but also a re-imagination and a re-invigoration, a call to more, not less, of short-term trips in the right way to serve the right things. So that's what this podcast is about. Hopefully it's interesting for you guys. Did I set that up well?
Amazing.
Sweet.
Amazing. All right. Well, envision us. How do you want to do this? Do you want to share some Bible or share some stories?
This is more of probably a philosophical conversation than a theological conversation. I mean, obviously we everything we do is from the Word, but I think it's more talking about the purpose and place. And I know you have some questions, right? So just interrupt at any time. But the purpose and the place and I want to take the position of the pros to investing time, energy, resource in short-term trips. Because I think most of the cons or the arguments against are not necessarily why, but how.
Okay.
From my perspective, when I read the stuff, and there's lots out there, this stuff about how short-term trips are not effective and a waste and stuff like that. It's mostly an argument against how they're done, not why they're done. So I think if we start with the why behind short-term trips, it might then lead us to the conclusion, and my purpose is to lead us to the conclusion of, oh, that's a worthy endeavor, so how do we do it in the most effective way?
Okay.
Right, so that's kind of where I'm at. So.
Okay. So what's the why?
Well, I think there's a lot of whys. Let's tease them out. The biggest why for me in short-term trips is that everyone has a part to play in the Great Commission. And I think you've been around me for years now. We've got to blur the lines when it comes to whose assignments are part of the Great, and how individuals' assignments are part of the Great Commission. Because in the last 20, 30 years, there's been some distinctions that I don't think are healthy, i.e., missions has become kind of a calling or an assignment instead of the mandate of the church that everyone is a part of. Yeah. And so you have missionaries, people who go do missions, and then people that do other things. And I don't think that's a great distinction. I think we've got to plumb line everyone's individual assignments back to the Great Commission, in the way that Piper famously talks about everyone. There's only 3 types of people that come to the Great Commission, right? Goers, senders, and disobedient. And so I think for me, short-term trips are a powerful reminder and participation with the global part of the Great Commission, and for us, the unreached part of the Great Commission, for everybody to play a part, even if they're don't have an assignment to be a career or vocational frontier missionary. And again, the effectiveness is actually in the how, not the why. And so I've found it to be, in our world in the last 10 years, I found it to be very, very helpful and effective to build short-term trips and the way we do it to give people with all kinds of different assignments in the kingdom the ability to participate in a real way in frontier missions. And so I think we start there with why short-term trips is because no one is on the bench when it comes to Matthew 24:14. There are different assignments. Many will carry a sending role, a giving role, a training role, a community role, building churches that send. Others will carry a go role. But I think short-term trips allows everyone to touch the Great Commission in a tangible way. And so for that alone, I think short-term trips are valuable. And I think a sub point of that, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I just had the thought, could you define what you think of when you say short-term missions versus
great.
mid, long?
Perfect. Thank you. So the way that we're talking about today on this podcast, short term, we're talking about anything under 30 days.
Okay.
Technically, in the missions world, short term is anything under 6 months to a year. But for what we're talking about anything under a month. We design most of our short term trips around 10 days to 2 weeks because that's people are able to hit pause on their other assignments, their jobs, maybe their one spouse can go while the other spouse stays with the kids, and you can do a week, and that's very normative to us in our environment is mom's on a short-term trip while dad's watching the kids and vice versa. And that's been very powerful. So for what we're talking about, short-term is under 30 days a month. Midterm, technically in the missions world, midterm is anywhere from 6 months to 18 months. And then long-term is 2 years plus. What we do with placements, so in our school, our MAPS Global School in the missions trek, they do their second semester is a 90-day placement. And that 90 days is longer than most any other missions organizations do their short-term stuff. And so our placements are starting to touch midterm experiences in terms of culture shock and language learning and assimilation. And that's why we do 90 days. So our placements kind of just touch the beginning of midterm. And then all our bases that are on the ground, they're all staffed by long-termers, people that have been there 3, 4, 5, 6 years. So that's what we mean. So for this purpose of the purpose of this podcast, we're talking about anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks.
Okay.
Cool.
Great.
Awesome. Thank you for asking that.
Yep.
So everyone's got a part to play in the Great Commission. The question's not, do I have a part to play? It's what is the part to play? And then short-term trips done effectively bridge the gap between the local and global in a community. I'll say it a different way. For me, my experience, and then also just philosophically, every church family and community has to embrace all three arenas of the Great Commission in Acts 1, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth, right? There's those concentric circles. And people have different emphases and focus and assignments, but the body, in my opinion, is that every body, spiritual family, really has to ask, how are we engaged in all three of those? And so really, I think we need to get rid of this false dichotomy of we don't do nations because we're focused on our neighborhood. We need to grow to, it's not either or, it's both and more. We have to be rooted locally. Church is not just officed out of their city. Church is a salt and light in the presence of Jesus in their city. Right? So for us, we're in Richmond. We're not just officed out of Richmond and working in the nations. No, we are planted in Richmond. We are serving Richmond. We're preaching the gospel in Richmond. We're making disciples in Richmond. So we're planted locally. We're present locally. in our neighborhood, and we're aiming globally and we're engaged globally. And I think that's where God wants to bring presence-centered churches, as he's raising up presence-centered churches. They're present locally, planted locally, but then they're aimed and engaged globally. And there's not this, and I wrote about this in the Antioch book, there's not this like, people are like, well, I'm a local church guy. Well, I'm a missions guy. No, it's actually both.
Yeah.
It's the mandate of the church, and every church finds their lane in the Great Commission. And so, short-term trips for me is a great way to bridge that divide, where your church and people in your church who are living, and their main emphasis is going to be in their neighborhood and in the city, but this trips connect them to God's global story and the work of the missions enterprise, particularly in the 1040 window for us. And so I've found, and I'm watching as other churches, and you know this, we've got now a handful of churches that are sending people through Maps Global to the 1040 window. And they're finding that it's connecting their church into the God's global storyline of Jesus' inheritance for the nations. Although on a day-to-day basis, they're very present and serving locally. And so I think short-term trips are one, if not the only, but one of those ways that we can kind of blur that disconnect and that dichotomy and that argument that if you're nations people, you can't be neighborhoods people. And if you're focused on the neighborhood, then you can't do nations. I go, no, actually, I think we can do both. And short-term trips are a great way to bridge that gap.
Right.
So, thoughts on that?
Well, as you're talking, I'm just wanting to know your answer. How I feel like a trip, it does so many things, but one thing it really does is transform the person that chooses to go on the trip.
That is one good output.
Yeah. But another, equally pressing question is, how does it also affect the places that we're going?
And that's the how.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the how, which we can get into, because I've read a lot of people that are sad and mad about short-term trips, but it's mostly a reaction to short-term trips done wrong, disconnected from long-term work, put the pressure of hosting on local and indigenous people, not cost-effective, and with the messianic or savior complex that I'm going in to save these people, or I'm going into for me, not coming in to serve what's happening. And those are all wrong ways to do short-term trips. So, but I think done in the right way, it actually, to the point of which we got to be careful, because I think it's right, it's legitimate. We should talk about the experience of the short-termer, because I think it is transformative. Mm-hmm. But that's not necessarily the primary motivation for why I go on a short-term trip, is because I want to have a great experience. But it is an output that really not only affects the short-termer going, but also the community that they're coming from and going back to. Mm-hmm. In a couple of ways. One, I've found that short-term trips, particularly in the 1040 window, they take terms like the Great Commission or frontier missions or unreached peoples or the Muslim world. They take it from an abstract concept to real people, real places, real faces. Mm-hmm. And that's really helpful for the overall missions thrust of the church. I can't tell you how many people, before they went to one of our bases in the Middle East, they just had a very monolithic idea of the Muslim world, mm-hmm. right? It's just kind of like this one monolith of people that all look the same, sound the same, believe the same, live the same, and they don't like Americans. It's just like the post 9/11 view of the Muslim world. And then they get over and they realize that it's a very diverse, when you say the Muslim world, you're talking about 3 billion people across North Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia. The Muslim world in Indonesia is very, very different than the Muslim world in in Syria. It's just completely different, right? And you're married to a North African, and the culture your husband came out of is very different than the culture in Turkey. But it's all Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
And so what's really great about short-term trips is that it breaks down a lot of our prejudices and just our preconceived notions about what this is, and puts real people, places, and faces to terms like unreached. We can't, as Americans, appreciate or empathize with living in an unreached nation because we don't have that experience, right? I drove by
Not at all.
3 churches to get to my church, but then once you're in that context and you're seeing and feeling and experiencing and then meeting and serving alongside people and hearing the stories of people, all of a sudden, to the point that you made about transformative to the person, the transformation's in the perspective and in the heart, and then the passion. Because once you see a face and you hear a story, it becomes personal, not just conceptual. And all of a sudden you leave, you come back, you're there for 10 days, come back, and all of a sudden when you pray and when you talk about unreached nations, there's places and faces to it, and it becomes personal to you. And when it becomes personal, then you take responsibility for it. And then when people like that come back into their communities, it now infuses the communities that they come from with passion and clarity and a personal ownership of the Great Commission, particularly in our context, the unreached. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. And so I've watched church communities get lit up for the Great Commission because people are coming back from short-term trips with places, names, people's faces, stories, and they go, we got to do this,
Mm-hmm.
And in that way, I've watched, and I think this is a really important kind of output of short-term trips for churches. There's, I don't know the latest number, you probably know, 7,400 something unreached people groups.
Something like that.
Right? 7,400. Which means that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of different assignments, even to different people groups and nations, still left within the Great Commission. Not to mention supporting the half the earth that's already, reached. When we talk about the 1040 window, that means that there's going to be thousands of churches that have a focus on a different people group and nation.
Yeah.
And right now, with the lack of proximity and experience in something like the Middle East, there's no specificity and clarity in churches on what's the nation, ethnos, people group, region that God's calling us to really adopt in prayer and giving and going. And so I think short-term trips really helps churches find clarity on what the Lord Jesus, the Lord of the harvest, is leading that church family, where he's leading them to invest in. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And without the short-term trips, and that includes pastors
Absolutely.
going and putting their feet on and coming back and going, oh, now when I stand up and say our church, First Anglican, church is going to be part of the Great Commission. Now it's not just a concept. We're going to sow into the gospel in Angola, and it becomes clear. And when it becomes clear, there's more energy towards it. So it's clunky and hard to do that without short-term trips.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're just kind of sending your money to another organization that sends missionaries, and that's great. But when you get people and leaders in your church community putting their feet into the 1040 window, now they come back with passion, names, faces, places, personal responsibility, and then it fuses and clarifies, I think, for that spiritual family what focus, what lane they're going to have in it. So, I mean, I hope as I'm talking, you're getting lit up and going, I'm back in, So,
it's pretty amazing that
Yeah.
we're able to do that in this day and age as well, because 100 years ago, it was a boat and that was it.
for sure. I mean, the opportunity,
Mm-hmm.
you can take that in two ways. You can kind of have a bad attitude about it, right?
Easy.
And that's easy. It takes no energy to have a bad attitude.
Not at all.
But, or you can look at it as we're in the season of history that we have the greatest opportunity to do the most short-term work in the most effective amount of time. Because to your point, let's take student volunteer missions movement, late 1800s to 1920, right? That was short. A lot of it was short-term, but the boat ride itself just to get to the place was longer than most of our guys spend on the field their whole lifetime.
Right.
And so the accessibility and the access that we have to there's very few nations that you as a U.S. passport holder can't get into. I mean, very few. And you would be surprised, and people are always surprised when I tell them this. I've been working in the Middle East and North Africa for over 10 years, never once experienced any cultural hostility towards me as an American.
Right.
I've been miles outside of ISIS territory and still not felt that. But the point I'm making is the access we have right now and the globalization, the ability to travel, we can see it as an opportunity to not only for long-term missions, but even for short-term missions to be the most effective generation in short-term missions in history. I think that's the opportunity ahead of us right now. So why not engage in that?
Yeah.
Yes, let's talk about the how, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater because some short-term trips didn't do well. Let's go. Actually, no, we have a great opportunity here.
Yeah. And when they're done well, it's clear that short-term trips are very helpful for long-termers.
Sure.
So helpful. When they're done poorly, it can be hard, but I don't think we even need to talk about that. I think you have an image in your head, but
Totally.
The way that we do it, it's catalytic for them, and a long months, long weeks of doing their work faithfully, and then 10 days they get to spend with a precious, lit on fire church
serving
team.
alongside of them and encouraging them, and that's where the prayer room becomes the landing pad for all of that, which is amazing. From our experience in MAPS Global, I just want to say this really clearly. Short-term mission trips can be, to your point, dynamic and catalytic to serve long-term missions and to support Indigenous church.
Help people stay on the field longer.
Not
that that's their main purpose, but I'm just saying it really helps. It really helps.
For sure. And this is part of why we do 90-day placements as a part of our missions track. I don't think that you can, I'll say it this way, it's an exception. I don't think you can even start to have the conversation with the Lord and with others about long-term mission work unless you've experienced short-term mission work.
Not in this day and age.
I don't think so.
No.
I mean, we're just not in the Hudson Taylor or Jim Elliott era of missions anymore.
It's not helpful
It's
anymore.
not helpful.
No.
I honor that, and they didn't even necessarily do it wrong or right. What I'm saying is in this day and age, people come in and they go, I don't know if I'm called to missions. I go, well, have you ever even stepped foot in another context? Well, no. Then can you really even understand what you're asking? Can you even really have the conversation?
Right.
So people come into our school all the time going, I'm going to be called. I'm going to spend, 20 years on the mission field. I go, go do 3 months, and then you'll actually know what you're saying, and then we can talk, And so if we do the math for a second, I think we can land this, and then we'll go to the how. I think that we can, by math alone, make a case for short-term trips by saying this. If there are 7,400 plus or minus unreached people groups, those are ethno-linguistic people groups, nations, without access to the gospel. Okay, that's not this podcast what that means, but if you've been tracking with MAPS Global, you know what it means. Okay, if that's true, and then you look at the numbers of missionaries sent into the 1040 window, which is only 3% of all global missionaries that are sent out, only 3% go to the most unreached of the world. It's called the Great Imbalance, right? So we send 97% of our long-term missionaries to nations and people groups that already have thriving churches. So we got to do that math. Here's the point. That means that there is a huge need for laborers within the unreached, the 1040 window. And if the scriptures are true, that a gospel witness is going to be in every nation and incenses are going to rise in every place, and the 100 other Bible verses, if that's true, and right now we're standing about halfway through, a little over halfway through completing that task, that means that there are thousands of people that are not in the right place or not in their final place, and they don't even know it yet.
Mm-hmm.
Because 82% of the church in America doesn't even know what the Great Commission is. And so short-term trips get a person to engage in the unreached, actually ask the question, see the Great Commission in action, which will lead to a conversation that they never would have had outside of going on that short-term trip, which is, do I have an assignment to do this long-term? I just don't see, honestly, out there, Jules, how we're going to introduce that conversation in a real way outside of getting people to spend 10 days on the ground in other nations. Because it's just not what they're getting in church. They're not getting it in American church. And it's going to take bringing people outside of that context for a moment, setting them in the 1040 window and going, and they go, oh, whoa,
Yeah.
I never would have even considered this.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so for
we
me,
have the capacity to do it.
totally.
It's so easy to buy
So
a
easy.
plane ticket to these places.
So, and it's not expensive. And
it's not.
And so for me, short-term trips are an effective way to open up the conversation about long-term assignments.
That's right.
And hooks people's hearts. So there's other ways to do it, but like, again, I could go teach a class, at a university and teach about the Great Commission all day long, but there's not without the experience, that person can't go, I should do 10 years in India if they've never even been across the ocean. It's a hard conversation to even have because it's so hypothetical. And so short-term trips, they open up the ability to actually have those conversations. And we're going to need to have thousands of those conversations if we're going to move towards the completion of the task of the Great Commission, right? And so, more than 10,000 of those conversations. Yeah. And so for me, let's lean into short-term trips, not away from them, and instead talk about how to do them better.
And I think that some people, I think there's a concept of special people are marked for missions. You talked about this at the beginning, but I just want to say it from my perspective.
Yeah.
There's some people, it's like maybe you were in youth group. There was that one girl that she wanted to go do an orphanage somewhere in Africa, and that's the missions option. Right. But it's not true. And you don't actually have to have this special intense call. That's a misunderstanding that you need to be, that God has to call you specifically to spend 50 years in a nation and die there.
That's right.
That's not missions anymore. It's not necessary.
It can be. Yeah.
Sure, but I think that's probably pretty rare, at least what I've experienced in the places I've been. It's a lot more fluid now. There's technology, there's planes. You get to go home for every 2 years.
Totally.
They didn't get to do that back then. And and I think it helps, short-term trips help people know that you don't have to be a superhero to be a part of missions.
That's right.
You can be a volunteer on a team for 10 days and you could actually see, I could actually live here. This is a normal place. You don't have to be Gladys Elward, That's right. You can, everyone.
Who is a pioneering missionary to
go.
China. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and this is also probably a new idea. I was just talking about this with the guys at Upper Room. The frontier of missions in 2025 is not jungles in the Amazon, jungle tribes in the Amazon, or remote villages on islands. There are a few of those left, but the vast majority of frontier peoples, unreached people groups, are in massive global cities across the 1040 window that you can get a direct flight in tomorrow, land, and you're in a city that's an unreached region but has an international context to it. And so just like the city you were just in, you didn't have a direct flight, but you had to.
I did not.
Yeah, it's because it's not that big of a city. But like the other cities we work in, and I mean, it's you take a flight in, and then you land there because it's. And this is get to the how, so I won't get ahead of myself. But you land there, you can be effective from day one without putting any pressure on the local church. But two, because of the international and the global dynamic of the city, there's a good chance you can find somebody that belonging to that nation that you can preach the gospel to in some form of English or some language to translate pretty easily. And you guys did that even a couple weeks ago. And so that we've got to get a new paradigm for when we say unreached people and frontier peoples. We're talking about mega centers of, 20 million people, 10 million people, 5 million people, international cities, lots of young adults, lots of exposure because of the internet to Western culture. In fact, I mean, I remember in our Middle East missions base when I was first working there, this Muslim guy who got saved, and he came to the house of prayer. And the way he got saved is he started finding worship music on YouTube from Upper Room and houses of prayer, and he was watching it and just encountered the presence of God, and then got connected with our base to find a place where he could worship like that with a community. So the cultural barriers are still there. We've got to contextualize, but the cultural barriers are shrinking a little bit. And so that, to your point, can take someone dropping in for 10 days to pray, preach, and sing, and they can do it, and it can be effective. Or somebody goes and does 2 years and then comes back home and then does another assignment. It can be massively effective, as well as the people who go and spend 10, 20, and 30 years there as well. Yeah. It's a great point. You're so smart.
That was our commercial break.
You're so smart.
Yeah. During the You're So Smart. Okay. Great.
So hows and stories.
Great. Here we go.
Hows and stories.
Okay. Yes, kicking it off now. So how's...
Uno, dos, tres.
How do we do short-term trips?
Are we on?
Yes.
Okay. Ask me again.
Okay, he counted one. We counted down and
Okay.
then... Okay.
Uno, dos, tres.
Okay, so
All right.
we're back. How? Now we're going to the how. How
So this is
do we do
where the
short-term
rubber
trips?
meets the road, right? So if we've bought in, hey, let's give short-term trips another thought. Okay, then let's talk about how we're going to talk about how we do it, because I don't honestly have a lot of commentary on how other people do it, right? Not enough.
Not
Let's talk
needed
about how
right
we
now.
do it, right?
Yep.
Because we've found short-term trips to be extremely effective in planting and supporting our long-term work and supporting the local church across the Middle East, North Africa, Arab Gulf, Central Asia, Himalayas for the last 12, 14 years. All right. So at this point, we have a body of work that goes, hey, I think this works. So we build our short-term trips around 5 things. And this is what's helped them be effective and enjoyable. First thing is that we build our short-term trips. We send our short-term trips to support where we already have teams that are working long-term, or relationships, partnerships that we're already working with. In other words, we don't just drop a team of 10 people in a city and say, hey, do your thing and meet some people. We as leaders do that relational work and that foundational work years ahead of sending a short-term team. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is we only send to our 7 locations right now, our 7 bases. And so what a short-term team, when they land, let's say they land at our Middle East missions base, they land right into the rhythm of life of our missions base there. And so the hosting and the connection doesn't need to be put on local churches, or indigenous pastors who are already overwhelmed and loaded. And
yes,
we can host it and support it from our base itself. And so our bases become landing pads for short-term trips. And so it takes the age-old argument against short-term trips that it puts so much pressure on churches who already don't have enough resources to try to host and create projects for Westerners to come in and feel good about themselves. That's the bad attitude about short-term trips. We've actually seen a different result where we're sending our teams where our long-term teams are already working, and our teams, short-term teams, come into the rhythm of life, and they are able to serve and jump right in with what our teams are already doing. Mm-hmm. And so we found that to be very helpful and supportive, and to your point, catalytic for our long-term work. So that's number one. We only send short-term teams to places where we already have long-term work, or we're on the road to long-term work. Mm-hmm. So that right there answers a little bit of the how short-term teams can be effective. Number two,
a fun fact on that is that last April was the first time that we sent a short-term trip to every location where of our 7 bases of our 7-year vision, 7 bases by 2028.
That's right.
And it was the first time that we had a team in every single location working either with one of our bases that's already there or with the partnerships that we've been working with
exactly right.
for years.
That's right. So last April was the first time we had teams in all 7 locations.
Mm-hmm. And the point of that, the reason I'm saying that is that's a catalyzing moment for that long-term work.
For sure.
For the places where there's not an established base.
Yes, that's right. And so that's number one. Number two, we build our short-term trips around prayer meetings. And that has been a little bit for us the secret sauce in short-term trips, is that usually at the center of that 10-day, you got a couple days travel on both ends, but really the meat of those days you're on the ground, you are jumping right into and participating in a unceasing worship expression and prayer expression. And this is, I could spend the rest of the podcast talking about why that's effective, but I'll distill it. And so you're immediately effective because you can step into that rhythm. Let's call it a 50 hours prayer. So it's 2.5 days of prayer. All our bases are doing daily prayer, but this is where we do it unceasing, like hour by hour, through the night, through the day, right? And a short-term team can jump right onto that schedule, and they can pray and they can sing for that nation, and alongside those locals and indigenous, all agreement together. If you believe prayer is effective, because if you believe it's a waste of time, then this short-term trip would not be helpful for you. Yep. But if you believe intercession is missional, that intercession really does open the doors for the gospel and push back darkness and release light, and God's presence has a geographic impact in places, not just a universal, or as the Puritan said, a prevenient, but actually it has a geographic impact, being that if you and I, with a team of 10, go land in North Africa with our team that's already there, and we together worship and build an altar for the Lord, and he rests, it's going to have a geographic impact on that region, not just that's different, not to minimize what we do in here, because we pray for North Africa from Richmond, but it's a different thing to build that altar in that region.
Boots on the ground.
Boots on the ground. You're dealing with real principalities in that nation, and God's presence transforms everything around it, right? And so, yes, it's prevenient, universal, but it's also geographic.
Yeah.
And so when a short-term team lands, we build it around these prayer meetings where they can jump right into the schedule and they can sing and they can pray, and it's effective. And they're not going to do a project for someone else. They're going to serve alongside missionaries and local indigenous people who are praying the same thing. And so there's agreement right there. And there's the prayer room itself becomes the environment, the landing pad where we can do effective short-term work without putting any stress on the under-resourced church in the region. So we build it around short-term trips. So all of our short-term trips, if you come on a short-term trip with Maps Global, at the center of it's going to be a nonstop prayer meeting.
Yep.
So you guys just did 35 hours, right?
We did 35, yeah. And if for you for if you're watching this or listening to this, you can hear more about this, a whole podcast about this, on a YouTube or on our podcast. It's called Mercy for the Middle East, how worship and prayer opens the door for missions.
Amazing.
So
What episode is it?
it is episode, where's the number? It is 136,
Whoa,
episode
136.
136. Yeah.
Sick. So we found that to be very effective over the last decade. Number 3, we serve alongside local believers and other missionary work. We don't go to try to make them do a project, or we don't go with the messianic complex that we're going to go save these people, or we're going to do a project for them, but we're coming alongside what's already happening. That's an important point. I think that's a paradigm shift for short-term missions.
And what God's already doing there.
That's right.
God's already moving. We're
That's
just
exactly right.
jumping in.
That's exactly
Yeah.
right. Number 4, then if you go on a short-term trip with us, and what we found to be effective is that we do outreach, right? It's not only prayer and worship. We have a bold approach to the proclamation of the gospel. And so what we do is we take short-termers, we put them alongside long-termers, and they go together to do the outreach. And there's a fresh excitement from the short-termer coming in, but there's experience from the long-termer, so they're able to facilitate the conversation. And we've just, you just saw 2 weeks ago, it'll be months ago now the podcast come out, but you just got back. Your team landed there, and within 3 or 4 days, they were able to do evangelism. We call it EV on the field. And you said preach the gospel from Genesis to Revelation.
Adam and Eve to the resurrection.
Adam and Eve to the resurrection. That's what you said.
That's what we called it for our trip.
In one of the most unreached nations in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And
totally illegal.
yeah.
Mega.
and see real engagement with it. And that's because we hugged up your team next to our team that's been there, who had already been facilitating those conversations.
Who'd already been joining in with the long-term work of people that had been there for 5-10 years.
And then we train our short-term teams with some cultural boundaries, some contextualization, so they don't just go in there and go and swing in and mess up mess up a relationship that's being built. And so it serves. And a person who has been showing interest now has heard the gospel, which is amazing. And we've given them Bible studies, in their language. But also our team members come back and go, I just got to preach the gospel in an unreached nation. Yeah. And in 10 days, I got to pray, I got to preach, and I got to sing. And I got to play a part. It's not the only part, but I got to really play a part in the push of the Frontier Missions enterprise moving forward. And it's just invaluable, So that's it was number 5. No, that was number 4, and then 5, and then we can tell some stories. Is that we build our short-term teams, and this is important to us. You can take this or leave it. We build our short-term teams into our short-term teams in an enjoyable experience. Mm-hmm. I think I've watched in the past, and I've felt like it's not been a helpful approach. I'll say it that way, trying to edit. But I just taken a team of, 20-year-olds, or in our case, multi-generational, and then throwing them into the most difficult situation, unprepared, with no structure, and being like, well, this is missions, you're going to get it. It actually doesn't help move everything forward. It actually just makes people disillusioned and frustrated, where they were under-resourced, they didn't get enough equipping on the front end, and then they didn't land where there was a structure and long-term work, and you just kind of throw them in the deep end, and this is real missions, and blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it actually is, I think, counterproductive to the long-term goal, which is sustainable, healthy, joyful, long-term missionaries on the ground. Yeah. And so we build into our short-term trips an enjoyable experience. Now, let me be very careful. We are not saying our short-term trips are vacations.
They're definitely not. Mine was not.
So that's not what I'm saying. So don't try to do that.
It's fun, but it's not a break. It's not restful.
But no, you said it perfectly. Yeah. We build fun into it, and fun being that our short-term guys landing there, they get to see and feel and experience some of the history and the culture of the region.
That's right.
So they get an appreciation and they get a heart connect, not only just to our base in this one city, but the region and the food and the smell and the experience and the
Totally.
language. And
They know who they're praying for. They know
who
the,
they're praying
the
for.
type of soil they have, and
they know what food they eat. They know what the inside of their living rooms look like. And they know what, a little bit of the history, because history in American history is so young.
Yeah, it's kind of lame.
Yeah, it was like 200 years.
Yeah.
You go into the Middle East and you're talking about millennia. I mean, I was just in Egypt, you're talking about history before it's recorded. They don't even know when they put the pyramids up,
That's right.
But just crazy. It's like, ugh. Anyways, we build fun or enjoyment into our short-term trips because we want people to pray, preach, sing, and come back and go, that's fun. I could do that. I could do another one. I would invite other people to do that. And they have enthusiasm about it instead of coming back going, that was so hard and we didn't have the support we needed and we got lost on, this thing and, oh, don't do that. That's not
Right.
the narrative we want to build around missions. Not saying it's a vacation. We're not building
It's not.
young people do an adventure called missions. That's not what we're building here. But what we are saying is for all the work and the hardship that is Frontier Missions, we want to make it as enjoyable as possible because we want to make it as sustainable as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So for that reason, those 5 reasons, we do short-term teams, and we've found them to be hugely effective and very valuable towards the missions enterprise. It's got a irreplaceable place in Frontier Missions, in my opinion, as we've seen over the last 10 years. So you just got back.
I did.
I would love to hear a story. How many people are on your team? 15?
15 people.
That's big.
That is a really big team. That's the
big.
biggest one I'd been on.
Yeah.
Yep.
How many of those people had never been on a mission trip before?
Well, I know at least one had never been out of the country.
Okay.
Okay. 2 had never been into a prayer room.
Well.
Yep.
Like ever been in a prayer room?
I think one had been in one before, but it was a small experience.
So
they both said,
our
I've never
prayer
been
room-
at a prayer room before.
So our prayer room in North Africa was the first prayer room. That's so cool. That's so cool.
Yep.
So,
We had a pastor,
okay.
a Lutheran pastor.
Amazing.
We had, I think, if I got it right, 3 moms,
Yes.
currently with kids under 10.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was hugging the dad's bed here going,
Yeah.
you guys got this. They're like, we're good. We got the
Yeah.
kids.
Even,
they had,
even
like,
toddlers. There's 2.
No doubt. They have
two-year-old.
like 4 kids.
Yeah. And then we had dads.
We're pro moms being engaged in the Great Commission.
Yeah.
around here.
The moms had so much fun. Oh my gosh.
I
They were like,
heard.
I don't have to cook dinner for anybody
Totally.
tonight. You're going to give me
That's
money to
awesome.
eat.
That's awesome.
Yeah. It was really good. Yeah. From teenagers to older people.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
You tell a story and I'll tell a story, and that's where we end. And then we'll invite people to our next short-term trip opportunity.
Okay.
All right.
Man, so much happened on that trip. Yeah. Well, one thing I'll say, I'll just kind of talk about the 35-hour prayer meeting. So, there were multiple people that had never done a missions experience before, someone who'd never been overseas. People that didn't necessarily even believe the exact same. I don't know how to say this. They believe in the Trinity, but like even some differing ideas or teaching on like the gifts of
theology.
the Spirit and stuff like that. And so when we did this 35 hours, it was crazy because the Lord just like met us. And it was people, again, that had never been in a prayer room that were just leading courses for a room of 30 people.
So
multiple
pause.
times.
Yeah, pause. When you say prayer room, just to give people a perspective, this is not like our prayer room here in Richmond or upper room in Dallas. This is, what was that prayer room?
Okay. 5 stories up, a terrifying staircase. You've been
It's like
on
a
it.
swirl. It's
Specially made.
Yes.
No OSHA. Okay.
Yeah, no.
Okay, so we get up there. We have to keep all the windows closed for
Yeah.
security. Also, we're not allowed to clap. We can't
Yeah.
Sing or shout too loud.
Right.
We have to be really careful with
Yeah.
security. So we're like, Jesus is alive. I mean, we got too loud multiple times.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
hard not
No, it's
to.
cool. It's cool.
But yeah,
And 360 view, you're looking over the city and the landscape there.
yeah.
But the rooms, I mean, no
It's
bigger
tiny,
than somebody's living room.
so sweaty
Yeah.
because we couldn't open
Yes,
the windows.
that's right.
We had a keyboard and a guitar.
Yeah.
And I brought mostly keyboardists.
Okay.
Okay. The keyboard stops working on hour 7.
Classic.
It stopped working. We think because of the humidity.
Probably.
So we kept trying. Yeah, it was so hot in that room. And so at one point we had someone who'd never played guitar before play an hour. Powerful.
Wow.
Now this is an anointed musician.
Yeah,
So I knew he'd be capable of this, but I
Yeah.
was shocked. Okay. Plays guitar, just plays like 2 chords for an
Totally.
hour. Beautiful set of intercession.
Amazing.
Another hour where one of our pianists that we had brought played a pad on YouTube. So that was just like an hour of the key of A, say, just like a
Amazing.
key, just like a
Yeah. And then
and just
sang to it.
sang over it. And another
So
woman who was
powerful.
on her first trip with us, a mom, and she sang with her, and they just sang for an hour prophesying over the nation.
Sick.
And we had people, somebody who had never led prayer before, who led prayer. It was very powerful. He's a dad of young kids, and he just got up and prayed for the spirit of adoption over. It's very powerful.
Amazing.
Then he stands up later in the meeting, and literally the Holy Spirit fell on everyone in the room.
Whoa.
And he was like, "What?" And I was like, "Yes, wow, this is amazing to see these people that never done anything like this experiencing it."
Yeah.
I mean, and you're getting my perspective as a leader, but
Yeah,
the
yeah.
35 hours, it helped people find giftings they'd never seen before.
That's
It
cool.
was so powerful.
Super cool.
I'll say the story. One set, man, this was so powerful, was so in this particular region, as you know, you've been, it is very oppressive for women, which Islam itself is, but this region specifically is very in a different way.
Notoriously, yes.
In a different way than you would expect. Very oppressive for women and their voices specifically.
Mm-hmm.
So we had a set where specifically we were going in to
A set
pray.
is a prayer meeting.
Yeah, an hour. So we
Yeah.
split it up in hours to make it more enjoyable. So we take
That's awesome.
turns leading worship and have topics and
Yeah.
stuff. And so we did an hour to pray Isaiah 61 over the women
Wow.
of North Africa.
Wow.
And so, yeah, that's the Spirit of the Lord has anointed me to bring good news, to
Amazing.
bind up the broken,
Yeah.
to set the captive free.
Yeah.
So, and what our beautiful prayer leader did was she got up and she had the women in the room, they could stand up and they could share their testimony, but not just like their whole testimony, but share what had been done to them to shut them down as a woman.
Whoa.
And pray that over the women in the region that
Whoa.
they would be freed.
I haven't heard this.
It was so powerful, Randy.
Whoa.
Like people came up and I was really surprised by the women that shared. And to be honest, they shared really intense stuff.
Wow.
And specifically there was a real highlight on sharing of being healed and freed from being abused as a child and as a wife. Physically and sexually abused.
Wow.
And as they released that, it was like a seed that went in the ground.
Wow.
And it was a groan that these women here can be freed from this, and they can walk in freedom,
power
and
of
their
their
voice
testimony.
can be unlocked. Yeah,
Wow.
it was wild,
Wow.
man. It was wild. So that was just one of the hours of the 35
That's
hours.
incredible.
Yeah, it was really cool.
Wow. Now I wish I was there.
Let me
right.
read. This is what one of the women that shared.
Okay.
This was I asked our team, hey, just send me like a paragraph on your experience. This is what she wrote. She said, "My recent trip to North Africa has marked me in every way I never knew was possible. I have been undone and burning for the unreached. A mighty man of God once said, "It's impossible to look at the face of Jesus and not see the nations in his eyes." This statement has wrecked me and became a deep-seated reality in North Africa. Seeing the faces of those Jesus longs for made the house of prayer like an oxygen. It became a Psalm 132 cry in my very being.
Wow.
It made his purpose my purpose. From witnessing in malls to sharing the gospel in taxis and ice cream shops, nothing became more apparent than Jesus wanting his bride. Lord, here I am to labor for your harvest, for your reward.
I mean, so that's it. I mean, like, that makes the case right there,
That's
doesn't it? Like,
Yep.
everything I just said about, I mean, she's going to go back to her church family, and that passion's going to be infused into the church. The church, we actually got report a few days ago that coming out of that 35 hours, another church from the States is said, how can we support this? We want to fund this whole thing.
Yeah.
And so the short-term trips are like that tether that pulls the church to engage
That's right.
in a real way. And now the conversation's open for her.
That's right.
What about?
What about long term?
Yeah.
What about how can I get this person I know on a
Exactly.
trip because they're built for this?
For sure. I love that.
So what about you? What story are
wanna hear
you
a
going to
story?
share?
There's one in my mind here. Well,
Okay.
I'll tell it the short version. I'm a storyteller, so I can.
Sure.
But I'll tell the short version, and then we'll end with the announcement. So this came early on, and this story is one of, again, at this point I have 100 stories, more than that probably. I'm not exaggerating, but this was one of the early ones that really was like, what is happening? So we had a short-term team in the Middle East, went to do a 100-hour prayer meeting. They do the prayer meeting. We had been doing 50 and 100-hour prayer meetings every year for a number of years. So by the third or fourth year, our teams were going in, and we were joining the people who got saved in the first and the second and the third ones, and they had been holding down the house of prayer. So it's just beautiful. So we go in, we send a short-term team. They 2 weeks. And they go, and one of the brothers, Muslim background brothers who had gotten saved 2 years before, was helping lead the house of prayer now. And he said, as our team came in, he said, I would love to introduce you to my family. And our team was like, can we do that? And he said, yeah, it would be great. He said, they actually live an hour and a half north up in the mountains. Would you guys be willing to take a day and go meet my family? And we love him, and we wanted to support him. And so we said, okay, we'll do it. We'll take a day. So our team gets in a couple of taxis. They drive up out of the city into the mountains, very rural part of the Middle East. And with this young brother, he's in his 20s. So they pull up into this village, and they go into the house. Now, you guys, if you're from the West, I know all our podcaster listeners are not from America, but something to understand about Middle Eastern culture in general is that it's very hospitable. And so our team goes in, there's about 10 of them with this brother, and they go in, and the whole family's there. Mom, dad, siblings, cousins, whole family. And they've prepared a meal for our family. Very, very normal Middle Eastern culture, very hospitable. So they all go in, they sit down in the living room, and it's kind of introduction time, right? And so as they're kind of making small talk, and the son, our friend, is translating, the mother starts to get very emotional, like visibly agitated. And so the trip leader's thinking, did we do something wrong? Like, what happened?
Sure.
Did we say something wrong? Are we supposed to be here? Those kind of things. And so they're trying to figure out, and she's getting very animated, and she's pointing at our guys, And so they're trying to figure out. So finally, they get the brother that brought us up there to translate. And they said, what's going on? Is it all right? Did we offend your mother? He goes, no. He says, this is amazing. He said, my mother just said that last night she had a dream. Have you heard this story? You might have.
It's not hitting
it's
yet.
Crazy. He said, my mother, this is crazy, said last night she had a dream. And she said in the dream, she was sitting in this living room, and she saw him and her and him and her, and pointed to our whole short-term team. She saw all of their faces in the dream the night before. And in the dream the night before, she said to these strangers in her living room, "Why are you here in my living room?" And in the dream, they responded, "We're here to share to you about Jesus." And so the brother's translating this. And so then the mother interrupts and she says something in Arabic, and she says, "Is that why you're here?"
Wow. That's crazy.
And so
Wow.
it was like, our guys were like, yes, that's
Yeah,
why
I
we're
guess,
here.
yeah.
Yeah. So they share the gospel.
Wow.
The mother and the siblings get saved. The father gets very angry and leaves. But the whole family, besides the father, gets saved. And then they have this meal together after sharing the gospel, because our short-term team was only there 10 days, went with a brother up to an hour into the mountains, and God had already prepared the whole family by a dream.
That's amazing.
Isn't that amazing?
Wow.
I mean, you can't make this stuff up.
That's crazy.
And
wow.
and so that's where it just started, man, there is something on this. Like, if we do it in the right way, it can be very, very powerful. So, speaking of doing short-term trips in the right way,
Are we going to do one?
we're going to do mini.
Let's go.
Okay. Do you want to do it or you?
It's you. This is, okay. All right. I'll set it up.
Okay.
Okay. This April. Dun, dun,
Dun, dun,
dun.
dun.
This April.
Coming this April.
For the second time, we are sending 7 teams
Plus teams to
to 7 locations.
That's right.
Okay, great. In April, and we're going to be doing a 50 hours prayer meeting all at the same time.
In
April.
concert together across the whole 1040 window almost.
Yep.
From the rising of the sun to its setting.
It's not just the Middle East.
No.
Yep. We've been saying
Himalayas,
Middle East for a while,
that's right.
but we have to expand our language.
Central Asia,
Yep.
Eurasia,
North Africa to
Africa,
Central Asia.
Himalayas, 50-hour prayer meeting simultaneously in 7 locations, a concert of prayer and worship.
Yep.
Last year we did this for the first time in all 7 locations, and we had over 1,000 people join us in those prayer meetings.
Yeah.
And we call it our 1040 window prayer meeting. We're going to fill up that whole window with incense for 2 days straight. And we're all going to agree together for a harvest, for laborers, and for the strengthening of the church. And last year was crazy. We had, in every single location, had the same thing happen to them. The same manifestations of the Spirit came into the room, joy and wine and healing. The same prayers and songs were being sung, not knowing that they were singing in the other locations, Jesus is King.
Yeah.
And we landed and we did the 50 hours across the 3 or 4 days where Iran launched those 300 missiles towards Israel. Israel was discerning how they were going to respond. The whole region was on the edge of kind of going into conflict.
Yeah, that's right. I forgot about that.
Totally. And we
That
were
was
right there.
intense.
4 of our locations were like, the missiles were going over. Like, it's crazy.
Yeah, we got rerouted on
That's
our plane.
right. And we were not in any danger, but
Sure.
the point is
This
that
is normal in the Middle
this
East.
is very normal. And we knew we were there to pray for mercy.
That's
God,
right.
give us more time. Keep
That's
the
right.
window open before this whole region, and there's conflict already happening, but before it spreads like wildfire and engulfs the region, give us more time to preach the gospel and plant churches and raise up houses of prayer. So that was the last 50 hours. So I can't even imagine where this next one's going. But what's in my heart is that this next 50 hours is going to be Isaiah 56, 7 and 8. I will make them joyful in my house of prayer. And I think that this next 50 hours is going to be just an eruption of sounds and songs and joy that's going to emanate out of the house of prayer and just open up the region for the gospel. And in the middle of the 2020s, we're going to see this thing turn around, and more laborers are going to send, and more doors are going to be open for the gospel than ever before in history. So I'm excited. You can tell them how to jump on a team.
Yeah, you can sign. You can sign up. You can also just fill out an interest form. I think that's what we have available. Yeah, an interest form. So you'll put your email in there, and then we'll go ahead and send you an email. So you can go to mapsglobal.org/short-term trips for that.
Short-term trips, one word.
Short-term
Awesome.
trips, and it'll also be linked on our Instagram.
Amazing.
It'll be linked on this video. If you're watching on YouTube, you can just click that link.
So the dates right now, that we've got planned. Things always can change, but right now we're in January, so 4 months from now, April 10 through 12 is the 50 hours.
That's right.
That we're all doing together.
Yep.
So the trip will be the 10 days around that.
Yep.
Right now, the trip is slated for the 4th, April 4th to the 14th. So if you want to jump in with us, take a week, send a team from your church, moms, marketplace, young people, everyone gets to play. Where it's not just a young adult missions movement. You got leaders. You want to get your elders and your leadership team exposed to the unreached and see what Jesus is doing in the 1040 window. This is a great opportunity. We can send you guys on a team together. We can spread you out, and your church can touch 5 or 6 locations on this trip.
Yeah.
Whatever best serves you. But we want to help host and help take you and help do everything we're talking about with these short-term trips. Engage, get your church connected to the Great Commission and the unreached, get people's hearts connected to names and places and faces, and massively support and help in these 7 locations where we're already building missions bases and houses of prayer. So April 4th through 14th, April 10th through 12th is the prayer meeting. If you want to jump in, you can jump on our website, short-term trips. Anything else you want to say, Miss Joels, before we sign off?
This is for everybody. This is for you.
So
apply.
Nike. Just do it.
Just apply. There's no commitment to fill out the interest form. So just do it. Even if you're just slightly interested, just fill out the form.
Or you can be super sneaky and send it to someone else.
For them to apply.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's right. Be like, hey, I was on this podcast and you were on my mind. Slip.
I love it. Yeah, whoever you're thinking of, send it over to them. All right. Well, we hope to see you guys in the 1040 window this April.
Let's go. See ya.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the MAPS Global Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to this channel and check out previous episodes. Have you seen our 50 Hours documentary? Watch it now. And don't forget to sign up for our email newsletters.